Hello and welcome to Understanding EQ. If you're watching this video or listening to the audio version, then you are a new member or customer of Understanding EQ. Really glad you're here. Thank you for taking the plunge and jumping in, and I'm going to do my best to provide you with a lot of value and a lot of information that you can take and apply to your next session and start getting better recordings. So this is going to be a lot of fun, and I think you're going to get a lot out of it. But first, let's take a second to talk about what understanding EQ isn't, so that we can make sure you and I are on the same page as we move forward. First off, this isn't an electronics class. As fun as it may be for you analytical types who are really kind of more engineers than anything, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, and you like to know all the circuitry and components inside of an EQ, we're not going to talk about that. That stuff is certainly interesting, but that's beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do here. I want to instill an understanding of how EQ works with music, not so much how the circuitry inside of an EQ works, if that makes sense. I don't think it's that important, me personally, when I'm mixing a record or mixing a song, to know what's inside that EQ that's making it do what it does. I'm more interested in knowing how to use that EQ to achieve the results that I want and to make it sound like I want it to sound. So if you were looking for more electronics-based stuff, you're not going to find that here today. So sorry about that. Secondly, this isn't really going to be a history lesson. I'm not going to go through the exhaustive history of the very first EQ that was ever invented and how that technology has evolved over the years and the different forms of EQ and all that. I'm going to talk some quick basic things about EQ just so we're on the same page, but then that's going to be it. So if you're into that sort of thing, you like to know the in-depth stuff about the guts of an EQ and the history behind it, there's plenty of resources out there for you to look into. If that's what you were thinking you were going to get with understanding EQ, then I'm very sorry. That's not what you're going to get. So if this isn't for you, that's not a problem. Just send me an email, let me know, and I'll refund your money and we can still be friends. Okay, for the rest of you, or if you still want to stick around and learn how to use EQ and just what it's all about, let's jump in. First thing we need to do is go over some terminology. There are different words I'm going to use probably a lot over the course of these videos. So I want to make sure that you and I are on the same page there. The main word that I'm going to talk about first, and the rest we'll get into as I talk about the different components of an EQ, what the different knobs do. But the main, if there was one word that you use the most when talking about EQ, it's going to be the word frequency. And frequency is simply pitch. If you're a piano player, every note on the piano is a pitch, and every pitch is a certain frequency. So middle C is a particular frequency. The octave C above that is a certain frequency. G is a certain frequency. F sharp is a certain frequency. And it's the same way with every sound out there. My voice right now is a combination of frequencies of different pitches blended together to give me this sound. So obviously there's more to that. There's things like harmonic distortion and all of those other things. But for EQ and in trying to understand EQ, frequency is really important. Now the frequency is measured in hertz. So undoubtedly you've heard either me or somebody else in the recording industry mention words like hertz and kilohertz. And all that is just a measurement. So the normal human hearing can hear down to 20 hertz and up to 20,000 hertz. Another word for 20,000 hertz is 20 kilohertz. A lot of times folks will refer to that as 20K, or you'll hear me say things like 1K for 1 kilohertz or 1,000 hertz. Or you'll hear me say 10K, 5K, 8K. I'm talking about kilohertz there. And so the human hearing is at best from 20 hertz down in the low end to 20 kilohertz. So any EQ that you see is going to most likely range from between those two frequencies. Some humans maybe can hear higher and lower, but most of us can't even hear that well. The average adult, I think, is somewhere around 15K, 16K, can't really hear those super high frequencies. But they say that babies can hear those when they're first born. And it just slowly, you lose some of your highs and lows over time. So I don't know. I'm not a doctor, but that's interesting. So we're going to talk about frequency and kilohertz a lot. So I want to make sure we're on the same page there. Now let's talk about briefly the different types of EQ, because you've probably seen these at one point or another, and it's good to know that they exist, and you may encounter them whether you're doing live sound or recording. Obviously, the bulk of these videos, just about everything we're talking about, is mainly in the realm of recording, but it can certainly apply to live sound. So if you have a studio at home, but you also run sound at your church occasionally, or you run sound for your band, or whatever the case may be, it's good to know what these things do. So briefly, let's take a look at those. And I've got the Sweetwater website pulled up with a couple of examples. The first type of EQ, probably the first one we ever encountered, is the graphic EQ. And that's simply just a huge row of these little vertical sliders, each one representing a specific frequency. So as you can see here, this one has a bunch of sliders. I think it's 30 altogether. And you see the lowest frequency, as we can see right here, is 20. And if we go all the way up to the highest, it's 20K, or 20 kilohertz. So this spans the entire range of human hearing. So this is a 2-channel, I believe it's a 31-band EQ. So it's got a left and a right. And as you boost and cut each of these levels, each of these little faders here, you're boosting and cutting that particular frequency. And so these are mainly used in live sound environments where you're trying to sculpt the way the room sounds. You could be in a particular room where 500 hertz is especially loud, so you'll use this you'll come in here and maybe pull down 500 hertz a little bit. Or maybe there's some feedback at certain frequencies in that particular room, so you'll pull those frequencies down, whatever frequencies are feeding back, to kind of take care of those. You're really not going to deal with this much in a recording environment. Some studios, even home studios, will use one of these to somewhat tune their room for acoustical reasons. If the room has certain frequencies that are problematic, that are really loud, you can turn those down in the EQ before it goes to your monitors. That's an option. For if you're just starting out, I'd say don't bother with that, but I just wanted you to have a brief look at that and what that is. Another type of EQ that mainly what we're going to be talking about is a parametric EQ. So a parametric EQ, and actually that is not the right mixer. Let's look up the 1642. Yeah. So a parametric EQ is one made of knobs primarily, and you use those knobs to dial in specific frequencies. So this one's not letting us see it quite as closely. Let's try a different one. Maybe the 1604. For those of you listening to the recording, we're just looking up on the Sweetwater website just a mixer from Mackie, the 1604. And there it is, just to give us a view. Now, we've all seen these mixers, and whenever there's live sound, there's usually something like a Mackie there. But if we zoom in here, you're going to see that here's the EQ section. There's 4 knobs. The top knob is your high frequency, and that is set at 12K, or 12 kilohertz. So you can't change what frequency that affects, but you can boost and cut 12K. And then down here on the bottom knob, that's set at 80 hertz. So you can boost and cut at 80 hertz. Now, the key difference here, basically the top and bottom knobs are just like a graphic EQ. All you can do is boost and cut a specific frequency. You can't change what that frequency is. If you wanted to boost and cut 60 hertz or 100 hertz, you just can't do it. On this particular EQ, that's not possible. You can only boost and cut 80 hertz and 12K in the highs and lows. The mids are different, however. You'll see there's 2 knobs here. This one is, the first one is blue like the others, and it's a gain knob, so it's simply turning up and down the frequency range. But here lets you pick what frequency gets turned up and down. As you can see, it ranges from 100 hertz all the way up to 8K. So it's a fairly large range between the highs and the lows. So you have some control over what frequencies you're using, and that's called parametric. So it's not really a full parametric there. Fully parametric EQs are like this. And this is mainly what we're going to talk about when we're dealing with EQs in Pro Tools or whatever recording software you use. You'll see what we're looking at here is an SSL EQ, and there's 4 bands of EQ. There's a high mid, a low mid, and a low. And each of these gives you the option to adjust the frequency. So you can adjust what frequency the high frequency knob is adjusting, high mid, and lows. So it's really, really versatile, and you can do just about anything with this. There's a couple extra knobs here, and we're going to get to that later as to what those do. So those are the basic types of EQ. There's graphic and parametric. There are other ways of looking at EQ, but no real need for us to dive into that too much today. So now that we know what those different types of EQ, we're really going to dive in and take a look at what specifically a parametric EQ does and how to use that in the recording situation. So I'm opening up Pro Tools here, and we're going to create a new session and just get started completely from scratch. So I'm doing this as we shoot this video. We'll call this Understanding EQ. And that hard drive is getting full, so hopefully it's gonna last for us. And we'll create a new audio track, and just a stereo audio track, and we're gonna take a look at the components of EQ. Now what I'm gonna do is just pull up the basic EQ that comes with Pro Tools, and if no matter what excuse me, no matter what recording system you're on, be it Pro Tools, Digital Performer, Logic, whatever, they're all gonna come with a basic parametric EQ. Now, a lot of these are going to have some sort of a graphical interface, which is great. Sometimes it's called a GUI, a GUI, a graphical user interface, and these are really great for learning. They also can be fairly dangerous. Now, what I'm talking about is the graph here that when I boost one frequency and cut another frequency, it shows you basically where the boosts and cuts are. So you have a graph in front of you, and you can see the EQ that you're doing. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but you can see how it could get really easy to start doing everything based on what you see rather than what you hear. And I could come in here and start doing all sorts of things trying to get a particular sound, and I'm basing it entirely on what I see in front of me. So it's really important to just be careful that you don't do that. It's a great learning tool, and when I'm teaching EQ, whether it's when I'm teaching how to mix or whatever, I'm going to show it to you in a graphical form most of the time, because that helps you visually see and learn what's happening. But always make sure you're using your ears to make these decisions. So let's go over the different components of an EQ. As we mentioned earlier, there's frequency, and in any EQ there's going to be a frequency knob here. Now this EQ here is called a 7-band EQ. Now 5 of those bands are a typical parametric EQ. So there's the low frequency, here marked LF, low mid frequency, high mid frequency, and high frequency. Now that's only 5, and I said this is a 7-band. There's also 2 bands of filters, which are right up here. We're going to get to those in a second. I'll explain what those do. And then you'll notice there's an input and an output gain on the EQ itself. So let's walk through the parametric bands of EQ and what the 3 basic components of any decent parametric EQ are. The first thing is obviously the frequency. So let's just boost this real quick so we can see. And we'll actually use this middle one for an example. Okay, so as we move this frequency up and down, you can see the number is going from down at 125 hertz all the way up to 8 kilohertz. So that's the range of this particular frequency band. And as I move it down and up, you can see the marker on the graph here is going left and right. So that's pretty basic. And just to explain this graph, this is along the horizontal line are different frequencies. So 20, 50, 100, all the way up to 20K. And then up and down is measured in dB or decibels. And decibels is simply a measurement of volume. So if it's here at this line here, it's around 6 dB of boost, or here it's at negative 6 dB, which is a cut, or it's going down in volume. Okay, so we determine the frequency knob moves it left and right. The next thing you're going to look at is the gain knob. Now this is, as I was just saying, is what lets you boost or cut by a certain number of dB. So in this particular EQ, it lets you boost or cut by 18. So that's quite an aggressive one. Some will only let you boost and cut by maybe 12 or even 6. And I rarely boost and cut by this much, but sometimes I do. So it's nice to have that there as an option. So as you can see, as I'm boosting and cutting, it's just increasing the amount of frequencies that get affected by this. So with everything set as it is, you can see when I cut this by 10 dB, it's affecting a huge range of frequencies. Obviously, if it's set, let's say, at around 500 hertz, then that's obviously cutting a big chunk at 500 hertz, but it's also, if you look, everything in this colored area is being affected. So all the way down even to 50 hertz and all the way up to 5K is being affected. It's not being cut as much, but you can see as it slopes up, it's being cut less and less, but it's definitely being affected. Now, you may wonder, what if I wanted to cut this fairly aggressively at 500 hertz, but I didn't want it to affect all these other frequencies? Well, that's where the Q comes in. Now, Q is I don't even honestly remember what it stands for. I don't know if it stands for anything. I think it's a part of a formula. But Q essentially means bandwidth. When you think of Q, think of it as width. You're thinking of how wide your EQ is going to be. So in this example, it's set to 1. And the numbers, I'll go ahead and tell you now, there is a fairly standardized rule for what the Q numbers mean, but different EQs are different. Where one EQ, if it's set to 1, will mean it's this wide. Another one may be a lot wider, set to the same number. So you just need to keep in mind that the Q adjusts width. Don't really pay as much attention to the number value of it. Just know that, and here's the key to Q. The higher the Q, the narrower the bandwidth. The lower the Q, the wider the bandwidth. So it's inversely proportional. As you raise the Q and make it a higher number, the boost or cut on that particular band of EQ gets much narrower. And we can show you that here. Right now the Q is set to 1, and it's a fairly wide cut here at 500 hertz. As I increase it from 1 all the way up to 10, you can see that this became a very, very narrow cut. And extremely narrow cuts like this are called notches, because it kind of notches out just a specific frequency. So now we've cut by the same amount, around 10, 12 dB, but you can see now that it's only affecting 500 hertz and just a little bit above and below that. So this is much less invasive on the rest of the frequencies. It's also a little less natural because it's not as smooth of a change. There's a big dramatic change happening in this little area. So it's going to probably have a more dramatic sound to it, and that may be what you want. It may not be, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, on the other side of the coin, if we take this Q control and we dial it back, and we pull it all the way back, all the way down to 0.10, you can see this, now it's cutting at 500 hertz by 12 dB, but it's also cutting the entire frequency range by a variation. Down at 20 hertz, it's being cut by a few dB. Way up at 20 kilohertz, it's being cut by a few dB. And in between, it goes anywhere from a couple dB all the way down to 6, 10, 12 dB. So you're never going to probably do a cut this wide, but it's good to know that that's there. So and a lot of times I've done a cut like this where it's only cut by a couple of dB, but it's really wide. I've done that a lot of times with various different instruments. Or maybe you just want to boost a bunch of the high frequencies, set it to a fairly low Q, and just boost it a little bit and let it be a nice, smooth, round boost of a big group of frequencies. There's a lot of options for things to do there. So, to review, frequency goes left to right and selects the pitch that you're adjusting. Gain tells the EQ how much to boost or cut that frequency. So if the gain is a positive number, it's boosting. If it's a negative number, it's cutting. And gain is measured in dB or decibels. Frequency is measured in hertz or kilohertz. And then the Q control isn't measured in any particular, it doesn't have a number or a word like hertz or dB associated with it. It's just a number. But keep in mind, as you raise the Q, you narrow the bandwidth. So larger Q, smaller bandwidth. Smaller Q, wider bandwidth. So it's the exact opposite. The bigger the number, the smaller the cut. The smaller the number, the wider the cut. Or boost, depending on where your gain is set. Okay, so those are the main things here. Now let's talk about filters, because most EQs are going to have some sort of a filter. Now a filter and an EQ, those are basically interchangeable terms. But typically a filter has to do with something that cuts off everything above or below a particular frequency. So in this example up here, you'll see these letters HPF and LPF. HPF stands for high pass filter, LPF stands for low pass filter. And it's a little backwards, and I know this would probably be frustrating at first, but a high pass filter cuts the low frequencies. It's called a high pass because it lets the highs pass through. It's also referred to as a low cut filter, but 9 times out of 10 you're going to see it referred to as a HPF or high pass filter. A low pass filter, on the other hand, lets the low frequencies pass and cuts the highs. In most EQs, when you first bring them up, it'll have all of these frequencies. You can see where they're on. Basically that N lets them be on and off. So let's say this one was cut. If I can toggle a particular band on and off if I want to A-B it with and without that particular booster cut. But the filters are usually not engaged because it may not be something you want to have at all times. But if you turn them on, then you'll notice that on the very highs and the very lows, there's a little slope there. And as we increase the frequency, for example, the high-pass filter, it's set to 20 hertz, so it's just cutting a little bit of the lows. As we raise that frequency up to, say, 400 hertz or so, now you can see there's this big, huge slope which starts at around 500 hertz and rolls down to basically turning the low frequencies all the way down. So a high-pass filter is a great way to get rid of low frequencies that you don't need. Now, you could be wondering, why not just use just the low frequency of the EQ instead of a filter? Well, let's take a look. If we take this EQ and we set it to that same frequency, around 400 hertz, and we do a cut, let's change that here, and we do a cut here, you can see it cuts 400, but it doesn't cut everything below that. Now, the highs and the lows of the high frequency knob and the low frequency knob also usually have an option to change them to a shelf. Now, a shelf is similar to a filter, but it's a little different, and it's very unique to the highs and the lows. If you change this to a shelf, which we can see here, it suddenly has this feature where whatever you cut or boost also gets cut or boosted, everything above or below that. So on the low frequency, let's say we have it set to 400 hertz, and we do a 7 dB cut. It's cutting at 400 hertz, but it's also cutting everything below 700 hertz. As you can see from the visual, there's just this horizontal line at 400 hertz that's all cut by 7 dB. That's the example of a low frequency shelf. And the high frequency shelf is the same thing. When you do a cut here at, say, 4 kilohertz, everything above 4 kilohertz has now been cut. So it's fairly dramatic, but it allows you to cut them evenly without getting rid of them entirely. So you can see, using the bell curve, which is the normal use of a parametric EQ, it's called a bell curve because it looks kind of like a bell. And if you did a cut there at 700 hertz, then everything at like 100 hertz and below isn't really being affected at all. So you'd still have that rumble there that you were trying to get rid of. That's where a filter can really help you, especially a high-pass filter. As you bring it up, everything, right now it's at around, 300 hertz? Everything at probably 100 hertz and below has been turned down or completely eliminated. And you'll notice here, there's a Q control on the filter as well. And this isn't necessarily a Q control as much as it is a control of how steeply it cuts off the low frequencies. Right now it's set to 6 dB per octave. That means for every octave, which is every doubling of a frequency, it cuts it down by about 6 dB. So for example, if this is set at 500 hertz, and the Q is set to 6 dB per octave. If we go down 1 octave from 500 hertz, that's going to be 250. If we go down here to where we think 250 is, which is about right here, you'll notice that everything's cut by about 6 dB. And if we go down again to 125, now it's about 12. So that's what that means. So that's a very smooth curve. It doesn't sound very aggressive, but it may not get rid of all the frequencies you want. So if you increase this to, say, 12, now it's a much steeper curve. As we go from 500 hertz to 250, it's been cut by 12 dB from here to here, as opposed to at the 6 dB per octave, it was way over here before it got cut by 12 dB. So this can go all the way up to 24 dB per octave, which is really kind of called a brick wall filter. And I don't use those very much because those tend to alter the sound quite a bit. So I usually don't do anything more than 12 dB per octave or 6 dB if I'm not trying to be super aggressive with the low end. Now I will tell you, 9 times out of 10, I'm never going to use the low pass filter, the one that gets rid of the high frequencies, because I usually like the highs. It's the low frequencies that can get you into trouble. So I use high pass filters all the time on my tracks. It may just be down here in the very low end just to get rid of everything below 50 hertz or so, or it may be more aggressive where I'm knocking everything below 400 hertz out. It just depends on the track and the song and whatnot. But very useful tool, and it's good to know that that's there. And as you can see, let me see here. They actually give you an option in this particular EQ to turn this into a basically a really deep cut. So you can change it between filter and this bell cut, basically a notch filter now. And now you can see that it is cutting at I can't even tell how much it's cutting. It looks like it's more than 18 dB. And as I move this around, you're probably never going to use that, or very rarely. So this will probably stay in in high-pass filter mode, so it's just rolling off the frequencies. So it's called a high-pass filter, and the frequency is usually called the roll-off frequency because you're rolling off everything below that. So if you're ever watching a video of mine where I'm talking about EQ and I'm talking about rolling off the low end, that's what I'm talking about. I'm using this high-pass filter to create this nice slope where all those frequencies get rolled off or turned down. Now, the only other thing to look at on this EQ is this input and output. Most good EQs, any EQ that's worth using, is going to have an input and output knob. Now, the reason for that could be a lot of things. It could be that the recorded track clipped a little bit and it's clipping coming into the EQ, so you want to just turn that down a little bit so it's not clipping going through the plugin. But a lot of times you may adjust the output gain. So let's say, for example, you've rolled off the low end, but you've put a big boost at 160 hertz. So you've actually added a lot of volume to the track. It could be that adding this volume is now clipping your EQ. You've put too much volume into it. Well, you can just turn down the output of the EQ using this output knob and compensate for that. On the other hand, let's say you did a bunch of cuts where you removed a bunch of frequencies here and a bunch of frequencies here. Now the signal's going to sound a good bit quieter because you removed a lot of information. In that case, it might be helpful to boost the output to compensate for all the cutting that you did in the EQ. So those are the basic components of an EQ. Let me review real quickly just so you don't forget some of the things that I covered. For the parametric sections, the lows, the low mids, the high mids, and the high frequencies, you've got your frequency knob that adjusts left and right, your gain knob, which is up and down, and your Q knob, which is how wide that cut is. Then over here, you've got your high-pass filter and low-pass filter. Each of those cut respectively the highs and the lows, and using the dB per octave selector, you can determine how steeply it's cutting those. They also give you an option to do some fairly dramatic cuts if you switch the mode there, but you're probably going to leave those as high-pass and low-pass filters. And then there's the input and output, which allow you to adjust the gain just in case you're doing some more aggressive boosting and cutting and you need to make sure that it's not clipping before it moves on to the next stage of the mix. Okay, so those are the basics of EQ and the components of an EQ and how they all work. So now let's go in and talk about training our ears and learning how to know what to look for and how to find it.